Have you ever wondered how a single man could transform from an abandoned orphan into the ruler of the largest land empire in human history? Picture this: a 9-year-old boy left to starve on the harsh Mongolian steppes after his father's murder, hunting marmots and scavenging ox carcasses just to survive another day. Fast forward 3 decades, and that same boy would command armies that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, conquering territories that modern nations still struggle to govern today. This is the story of Temüjin, better known to history as Genghis Khan, and what I'm about to reveal will completely change how you think about power, survival, and human potential. Because here's what most people don't understand about Genghis Khan. His success wasn't just about military genius or ruthless brutality. Recent scientific discoveries have uncovered something far more fascinating. Climate researchers studying ancient Siberian pine trees have discovered that Khan's rise to power coincided precisely with unusual rainfall patterns that transformed the barren Asian steppes into flourishing grassland. Genetic studies reveal that roughly 16 million men alive today carry his DNA, and archaeologists using cutting-edge satellite technology are still hunting for his tomb, which remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. But none of that matters if you don't understand where it all began. So let me take you back to the year 1162, to a world where survival meant everything and weakness meant death. The Mongol steppes were not a place for the faint of heart. Imagine endless grasslands stretching beyond the horizon, where winter temperatures plunged to -40 degrees and summer brought scorching heat that could kill a man in hours. This was a land where nomadic tribes moved constantly, following their herds, fighting over grazing rights, and where blood feuds could span generations. Into this brutal world was born a child named Temüjin, son of Yasuge, chieftain of the Börte clan. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Yasuge wasn't just any tribal leader. He was a member of the royal Börte clan, which meant Temüjin was born into what passed for nobility among the Mongols. His mother, Huelun, originally belonged to the Olkonud clan, but she'd been kidnapped by Yasuge in a raid. This wasn't unusual. In fact, it was Tuesday for the Mongols. But Temüjin's privileged birth meant nothing when disaster struck. Picture this scene. 9-year-old Temüjin is playing near his family's camp when riders approach with devastating news. His father, the mighty Yasuge, has been poisoned by the Tatars, their hereditary enemies. The Tatars had invited Yasuge to share a meal, and in keeping with steppe hospitality customs, he couldn't refuse. But hospitality and revenge made strange bedfellows on the Mongol plains. What happened next reveals everything you need to know about the savage politics of tribal life. With their leader dead, the Taijut family, rivals within the clan, saw their opportunity. They looked at Yasuge's widow and her children and made a calculation as cold as the steppe winter. These people were now a burden, mouths to feed with no strong man to lead them, so they abandoned them. Let that sink in for a moment. Huelun, pregnant with her 6th child, suddenly found herself alone in one of the harshest environments on earth, with 5 young children, including 9-year-old Temüjin. No horses, no herds, no protection. The clan that should have cared for them simply rode away, leaving them to die. Most families wouldn't have lasted a week, but Huelun was not most mothers. This woman, who would later be remembered as one of history's most formidable matriarchs, looked at her starving children and made a decision that would change the world. She would not let them die. What followed were years that would have broken lesser people. The family lived like animals, scavenging for wild fruits, digging for roots, and hunting whatever small game they could catch. Temüjin and his brothers became expert at tracking marmots, catching fish with their bare hands, and fighting off wolves for scraps of meat. They learned to survive on ox carcasses, abandoned by other tribes, picking clean bones that others had left behind. But here's the crucial detail that most histories overlook. This wasn't just about physical survival. Every day of hunger, every night spent shivering in inadequate shelter, every humiliation at the hands of former allies was forging something extraordinary in young Temüjin. The boy, who would become Genghis Khan, was learning lessons that no palace education could provide. He learned that blood ties meant nothing when survival was at stake, He learned that strength respected no birthright. He learned that the world was divided into two types of people: those who took what they needed to survive, and those who didn't survive at all. The transformation from victim to predator began with an act that shocked even his hardened family. Temüjin's older half-brother Börte had begun asserting his authority as the eldest male, claiming the best food and threatening to claim their mother as his wife when he came of age, as steppe custom allowed. For most families, this would have been accepted as natural order. But Temüjin had learned something different from his years of starvation. He'd learned that natural order was whatever you could enforce with strength and cunning. So he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He killed his half-brother. Think about that for a moment. A boy, probably no more than 13 years old, cold-bloodedly murdered his own brother over a dispute about food and power. When his mother confronted him about it, his response was chilling in its simplicity. "We have no companions but our shadows." This wasn't the act of a psychopath. This was the calculation of someone who understood that in his world, mercy was a luxury that meant death. From that moment, Temüjin became the undisputed head of his household, responsible for keeping his family alive in a world that wanted them dead. But survival was just the beginning, because what happened next would set in motion events that would reshape the entire world. The Temüjins, learning of Börte's death, and perhaps fearing what the boy might become, decided to finish what they'd started years earlier. They captured Temüjin and fitted him with a wooden collar called a kangu, planning to keep him as a slave, or execute him when convenient. Here's where we see the first glimpse of the tactical genius that would later conquer half the world. Temüjin didn't rage against his captors or try to fight his way out. Instead, he watched, he waited, and he planned. During a festival when his guards were drunk, he struck one of them with his wooden collar and escaped into the river. But escape was only the first part of his plan. Hidden in the reeds, soaking wet and still wearing the collar that marked him as a fugitive, Temüjin made a decision that revealed his understanding of human nature. Instead of fleeing into the wilderness, he approached the camp of Sorghum Shira, a Temüjin, who had shown him small kindnesses during his captivity. This was an enormous gamble. Sorghum Shira could have turned him in for a reward or killed him on the spot. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The man looked at this teenage fugitive and saw something that made him risk his own life. He hid Temüjin, helped remove the collar, and eventually allowed him to escape back to his family. What had Sorghum Shira seen? Perhaps it was Temüjin's calm courage in the face of death. Perhaps it was the calculating intelligence that had engineered his escape. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. Something that would later inspire millions of warriors to follow this man to the ends of the earth. Whatever it was, Temüjin had learned another crucial lesson. Even enemies could become allies if you understood what motivated them. This insight would later become one of his most powerful weapons, allowing him to unite tribes that had been killing each other for generations. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because at this point in our story, Temüjin was still just a teenager with a small family group, barely surviving on the margins of Mongol society. The transformation from outcast to conqueror would require allies, and finding those allies would mean navigating the treacherous world of steppe politics, where today's friend could be tomorrow's executioner. The question was, how does someone with no army, no wealth, and no political connections begin building an empire? The answer would revolutionize not just warfare, but the very concept of leadership itself. The answer lay in understanding something that every other tribal leader had missed. Loyalty could be earned, but it could never be inherited. While traditional Mongol chiefs relied on blood ties and ancient tribal hierarchies, Temüjin began doing something revolutionary. He started building alliances based on merit and mutual benefit rather than family connections. This wasn't just progressive thinking. It was survival strategy at its most brilliant. His first major alliance came through an unlikely source, his father's old friendship with Togrul, leader of the Karayites. Now, here's what makes this fascinating. Togrul was a powerful Khan who could have easily ignored the son of his dead friend. But Temüjin didn't approach him as a beggar asking for charity. Instead, he presented himself as a valuable ally who could offer something in return. What could a teenage outcast possibly offer a powerful Khan? Information. Temüjin had spent years on the margins of tribal society, watching, listening, learning the movements and weaknesses of various clans. He understood the steppe's political landscape better than leaders who lived in comfortable isolation. When he approached Togrul, he came bearing intelligence about tribal movements and potential threats. But the real masterstroke came when Temüjin's wife Börte was kidnapped by the Merkits in revenge for his mother's abduction decades earlier. Most men would have mourned, raged, or accepted their loss. Temüjin turned tragedy into opportunity. He convinced both Togrul and his childhood friend Jamuka to join him in a rescue mission, not just to save his wife, but to destroy the Merkits as a fighting force. Think about the psychology here. Temüjin transformed a personal crisis into a military campaign that benefited all his allies, while demonstrating his value as a strategic partner. The rescue succeeded spectacularly. They didn't just retrieve Börte, they scattered the Merkits and captured thousands of horses, the ultimate currency of steppe warfare. But here's the crucial detail. Instead of keeping all the spoils for himself, Temüjin distributed them generously among his allies and followers. This wasn't generosity, it was investment in future loyalty. Word of this victory spread across the steppes like wildfire. Here was a young leader who could turn desperate situations into profitable ventures, who shared wealth rather than hoarding it, and who treated competent followers better than incompetent relatives. Warriors began defecting from other tribes to join his growing band. Now, most tribal leaders would have been satisfied with this success. They'd have settled into comfortable leadership of a medium-sized clan and lived out their days raiding neighbors. But Temüjin was thinking on a completely different scale. He'd learned something crucial during those years of starvation. Small thinking led to small results, and small results meant eventual destruction. While others fought over grazing rights and cattle, Temüjin began articulating a vision that no Mongol had ever conceived. Complete unification of all steppe tribes under single leadership, not temporary alliances or seasonal cooperation, but permanent unity. The idea was so radical, it bordered on insanity. The steppes had been divided for centuries. Mongols, Tatars, Kiraites, Naimans, Merkits, dozens of tribes with ancient grudges and incompatible interests. Asking them to unite was like asking wolves to become vegetarians. It went against everything they understood about tribal identity. But Temüjin had a secret weapon that his rivals couldn't match. He understood that people's deepest loyalty wasn't to abstract concepts like tribal tradition, but to leaders who could improve their lives. He began implementing policies that were revolutionary for their time. First, he abolished inherited rank within his own forces. Your position in his army depended entirely on merit and performance, not bloodline. A herder's son who proved himself in battle could command nobles who showed cowardice. This wasn't just military reform, it was social revolution. Second, he instituted a decimal system of organization that ignored tribal boundaries. His forces were organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, with commanders chosen for competence rather than heritage. A Tatar who proved his loyalty could command Mongols. A former enemy who demonstrated skill could lead his own countrymen. Third, and perhaps most importantly, he established a code that protected the families and property of his followers. Rape, theft, and abandonment of comrades became capital offenses. For warriors accustomed to the brutal uncertainties of tribal warfare, this promise of security for their loved ones was incredibly powerful. The results were unprecedented. Entire clans began switching sides, not through defeat, but through attraction to what Temüjin was building. His forces weren't just growing, they were becoming more cohesive and effective with each addition. But this success inevitably led to confrontation with the most dangerous enemy of his career, his childhood friend Jamuka. Jamuka was everything Temüjin wasn't. Born to high rank, charismatic, traditional in his approach to leadership. He represented the old way of doing things, where blood and heritage determined worth. As Temüjin's unconventional methods gained followers, Jamuka saw his own traditional authority threatened. The conflict between these two men wasn't just personal, it was ideological. Jamuka fought to preserve the ancient tribal system where noble birth guaranteed respect. Temüjin fought to create something entirely new, where respect had to be earned through results. Their rivalry would span decades and involve almost every tribe on the steppes. It was a war between past and future, tradition and innovation, inherited privilege and earned authority. The winner wouldn't just control the Mongol tribes, they'd determine what kind of civilization would emerge from the steppes. The first major confrontation came at the Battle of Dalan-Balzut, around 1187. Jamukha commanded a massive coalition of traditional tribal leaders, all united in their opposition to Temüjin's revolutionary ideas. On paper, it should have been a massacre. Jamukha's forces outnumbered Temüjin's by a significant margin, but numbers meant nothing if you didn't understand how to use them effectively. While Jamukha relied on traditional steppe tactics of mass cavalry charges, Temüjin employed something entirely different: coordinated unit tactics that treated his army as a single organism rather than a collection of individual warriors. The battle was a disaster for Temüjin's forces, but not for the reasons you might expect. He lost badly, and many of his followers were captured or killed. But defeat taught him something invaluable. Even revolutionary ideas couldn't overcome poor intelligence and inadequate preparation. Instead of crushing his spirit, this defeat refined his methods. Temüjin realized that innovation without information was just elaborate suicide. He began developing the most sophisticated intelligence network the steppes had ever seen, using merchants, shamans, and even enemy deserters to gather detailed information about opposing forces. More importantly, he learned to read the deeper currents of tribal politics. Victory wasn't just about winning battles, it was about understanding why people fought and what they really wanted. Most tribal leaders fought for glory, revenge, or tradition. Temüjin began offering something more practical: security, prosperity, and purpose. When warriors defected from Jamukha's coalition and explained their reasons, a pattern emerged. They weren't just switching sides because of military success. They were attracted to a vision of life, where competence mattered more than birth, where loyalty was rewarded with opportunity, and where strength served a greater purpose than mere survival. This wasn't just military strategy anymore. Temüjin was creating the blueprint for a completely new kind of society, one that would eventually stretch from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. But first, he had to survive long enough to implement it, and that survival would depend on mastering the most dangerous game of all: the politics of power among people who trusted no one and forgave nothing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the Tatars themselves, the very people who had murdered his father. In 1196, Temüjin received intelligence that would change everything. The Jin dynasty of northern China, constantly harassed by Tatar raids, had decided to solve their nomad problem once and for all. They were planning a massive military campaign to crush the Tatars, and they needed local allies who knew the terrain. Here's where we see Temüjin's political genius at its most calculating. While every other Mongol leader saw this as an opportunity for simple revenge, Temüjin recognized something far more valuable: legitimacy. The Jin weren't just offering him a chance to destroy his enemies, they were offering him recognition as a legitimate political entity. An alliance with the most powerful empire in the region would transform him from outlaw chieftain to acknowledged leader. But accepting meant abandoning the traditional steppe code that said you fought your own battles with your own people. It meant acknowledging foreign authority over Mongol affairs. Most tribal leaders would never have considered such a compromise of their independence. Temüjin didn't just consider it, he embraced it as the key to everything he was building. The campaign against the Tatars was a masterpiece of coordinated destruction. While the Jin forces engaged the main Tatar army, Temüjin struck at their camps, their supply lines, their families. This wasn't just warfare, it was systematic elimination of an entire people as a political force. When the smoke cleared, the Tatars, who had terrorized the steppes for generations, were scattered to the winds. The Jin, impressed by Temüjin's effectiveness, granted him an official title. They acknowledged him as a legitimate leader of the Mongols. On the surface, this seemed like a minor diplomatic courtesy. In reality, it was revolutionary. For the first time in steppe history, a foreign power had recognized a Mongol leader as something more than a barbarian chieftain. But Temüjin understood something his Chinese allies didn't. He'd used them to destroy his enemies and gain legitimacy, but he had no intention of remaining their subordinate forever. The alliance was a stepping stone, not a destination. While the Jin thought they'd gained a useful buffer against steppe raiders, they'd actually helped create the force that would eventually destroy them. The victory over the Tatars sent shockwaves across the steppes. Tribes that had considered Temüjin a dangerous upstart suddenly saw him as an unstoppable force. The psychological impact was even more important than the military victory. Here was proof that his revolutionary methods could defeat traditional enemies that had seemed invincible. Warriors began defecting to his cause in unprecedented numbers. But these weren't desperate men seeking any leader who would have them. These were seasoned fighters making calculated decisions about their futures. They looked at what Temüjin had accomplished and concluded that following him offered better prospects than fighting against him. Among these new recruits were some of the most talented military minds of the era. Jebe, who would become one of history's greatest cavalry commanders, Subutai, whose strategic brilliance would later terrorize Europe. These men didn't join Temüjin's forces because of tribal loyalty or family connections. They joined because they recognized genius when they saw it and wanted to be part of something unprecedented. This influx of talent created a feedback loop that accelerated Temüjin's rise exponentially. Better commanders meant more effective campaigns. More effective campaigns meant greater spoils and prestige. Greater spoils and prestige attracted even more talented followers. Within just a few years, Temüjin commanded not just the largest force on the steppes, but the most professional and innovative. The traditional tribal leaders watched this transformation with growing alarm. They'd initially dismissed Temüjin as an upstart who would burn out like a grass fire. Now they realized they were facing something entirely different. A systematic revolution that threatened everything they understood about steppe society. Jamukha, still commanding significant traditional forces, made one last desperate attempt to stop his former friend's rise. He formed a grand coalition of every remaining tribe that opposed Temüjin's innovations: Merkits, Naimans, Tatars, Karaites, who had turned against their former ally. It was the largest army the steppes had ever seen, united by their fear of what Temüjin represented. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Chakimot in 1201. This wasn't just another tribal conflict. This was a collision between two completely different visions of what the Mongol people could become. On one side stood the defenders of ancient tradition, where birth determined worth and tribal boundaries were sacred. On the other stood the advocates of revolutionary change, where merit determined rank and unity transcended old divisions. What happened next would be studied by military historians for centuries. Jamukha's coalition vastly outnumbered Temüjin's forces and included some of the most experienced warriors on the steppes. By every traditional measure, they should have won decisively. Instead, they suffered one of the most complete defeats in steppe history. The difference wasn't just tactical. Though Temüjin's coordinated unit system proved devastatingly effective against traditional mass charges, the real difference was psychological. Jamukha's coalition was united only by what they opposed. Temüjin's forces were united by what they were building together. When the battle turned against them, Jamukha's allies began abandoning the field. Ancient tribal rivalries resurfaced as different groups blamed each other for the disaster. The coalition that had seemed so powerful on paper dissolved into chaos as its fundamental contradictions were exposed under pressure. Temüjin's forces, by contrast, fought with the discipline and coordination of a single organism. When one unit was threatened, others moved to support it without waiting for orders. When opportunities appeared, commanders seized them without needing permission from higher authority. This wasn't just military efficiency. It was a demonstration of what unified purpose could accomplish. The victory at Chakimot marked the end of organized resistance to Temüjin's revolution. The surviving traditional leaders faced a stark choice: submit to the new order or face individual destruction. Most chose submission, bringing their followers into Temüjin's growing empire. But even in victory, Temüjin demonstrated the political sophistication that would define his reign. Instead of executing the defeated leaders or humiliating them publicly, he offered them positions of responsibility within his new system. This wasn't mercy, it was calculation. These men still commanded respect among their followers. By incorporating them into his hierarchy, Temüjin gained their loyalty while avoiding the resentment that harsh treatment would have created. The most dramatic example of this policy was his treatment of Jamukha himself. When his former friend was finally captured by his own disillusioned followers and delivered to Temüjin's camp, everyone expected swift execution. Instead, Temüjin offered his childhood companion a position as his second in command. Jamukha's response revealed the fundamental difference between them. He refused the offer, stating that there could be only one sun in the sky. He understood that their conflict had moved beyond personal rivalry into something larger. They represented incompatible visions of leadership, and only one could survive. Jamukha's execution was carried out according to his own wishes, death without the shedding of blood, as befitted his royal status. But his final words to Temüjin were prophetic. "You have won because you understood what I never could. The steppes don't need another tribal chief. They need something entirely new." By 1206, that something entirely new was ready to be born. Temüjin had spent 2 decades transforming not just himself, but the entire concept of steppe leadership. He'd united tribes that had been enemies for centuries. He'd created a military system that combined traditional Mongol mobility with revolutionary organizational methods. He'd built a society where merit mattered more than birth, and where loyalty was rewarded with opportunity. The Great Kurultai, the assembly of all Mongol tribes, gathered at the source of the Onon River to acknowledge what everyone already knew. The age of divided tribes was over. In its place stood something the world had never seen before, a unified Mongol nation under a single leader whose authority transcended traditional boundaries. When the assembled chieftains proclaimed Temüjin as Genghis Khan, universal ruler of all Mongols, they weren't just choosing a new leader. They were endorsing a complete transformation of steppe society. The boy who had once scavenged for scraps to survive had become the architect of the world's most successful nomadic empire. But this was only the beginning, because while Genghis Khan had unified the Mongols, he'd also created something far more dangerous, a perfectly efficient military machine with no remaining enemies on the steppes. That machine needed new challenges, new conquests, new worlds to conquer. And just beyond the borders of his new empire lay the richest, most advanced civilizations on Earth: the Jin dynasty of northern China, the Song dynasty of southern China, and the Khwarezmian Empire that controlled the Silk Road. These ancient kingdoms had grown fat and complacent behind their walls and armies, never imagining that the barbarians of the steppes could pose any serious threat. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The transformation from Temüjin, the survivor, to Genghis Khan, the conqueror, was complete. But the transformation of the world was just beginning. The newly crowned Genghis Khan didn't waste time celebrating his coronation. While other rulers might have been content to enjoy their newfound power, he was already calculating his next moves with the cold precision that had carried him from outcast to emperor. Because here's what separated Genghis Khan from every other conqueror in history. He understood that standing still meant dying, and dying meant everything he'd built would crumble into dust. The first target was obvious. The Western Xia Kingdom controlled crucial trade routes along the Silk Road, and their fortified cities represented everything the Mongols had never faced before: massive stone walls, sophisticated siege defenses, and armies that fought from fixed positions rather than on horseback. Most nomadic leaders would have avoided such challenges, sticking to what they knew. But Genghis Khan saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. The siege of Zhongxing, the Western Xia capital, became a laboratory for Mongol innovation. Traditional steppe warfare was useless against 30-foot walls and organized infantry formations, so Genghis Khan did something revolutionary. He learned. Chinese engineers captured in earlier raids were put to work designing siege engines. Captured artillery specialists taught his forces how to operate catapults and trebuchets. Enemy tactics were studied, analyzed, and improved upon. But the real breakthrough came from understanding siege warfare's psychological dimension. While his engineers worked on breaching the walls, Genghis Khan implemented a strategy that would become his signature: total warfare against civilian populations. This wasn't random brutality, it was calculated terror designed to break enemy morale before the first arrow was fired. Cities that surrendered immediately were treated with relative mercy. Their populations were incorporated into the growing Mongol system, their skilled craftsmen relocated to serve the empire's needs. But cities that resisted faced complete annihilation. Every man, woman, and child was killed, their buildings razed, their very existence erased from history. Word of these massacres spread faster than Mongol horses. City after city opened their gates rather than face destruction. What had started as a military campaign became a psychological avalanche that swept away centuries of Chinese defensive strategy. The Western Shah, who had survived for generations behind their walls, collapsed in less than 2 years. The victory revealed something crucial about Genghis Khan's approach to empire building. While European conquerors typically imposed their own culture on defeated peoples, the Mongols did something far more sophisticated. They absorbed the best elements of every civilization they encountered, while discarding what didn't serve their purposes. Chinese siege techniques were combined with Mongol mobility. Persian administrative systems were merged with steppe meritocracy. Islamic astronomical knowledge was integrated with shamanic spiritual practices. The result wasn't just conquest. It was synthesis on a scale the world had never seen. This adaptive approach became even more important when Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Jin dynasty, the most powerful empire in East Asia. The Jin controlled northern China from their capital at Zhongdu, modern Beijing, and commanded resources that dwarfed anything the Mongols had previously encountered. Their armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their cities were protected by engineering marvels, and their generals had been studying warfare for centuries. The conventional wisdom said that nomadic raids might capture some border territory, but no steppe confederation could seriously threaten an empire with the Jin's resources and sophistication. The Jin emperors themselves believed this, viewing Mongol expansion as a temporary annoyance that would burn itself out against superior Chinese civilization. They fundamentally misunderstood what they were facing. This wasn't another tribal confederation seeking plunder and tribute. This was a revolutionary military system designed to absorb and improve upon everything it encountered. When Genghis Khan's armies crossed into Jin territory in 1211, they brought with them 2 decades of institutional learning about how to destroy advanced civilizations. The campaign that followed redefined the possibilities of nomadic warfare. Instead of hit-and-run raids, the Mongols conducted systematic conquest designed to permanently incorporate Jin territory into their empire. Chinese cities weren't just captured, they were transformed into bases for further expansion. Chinese engineers weren't just employed, they were integrated into Mongol command structures. The siege of Zhongdu demonstrated this integration at its most sophisticated. Traditional Mongol tactics proved useless against the city's massive fortifications and professional garrison. So Genghis Khan improvised, using Chinese siege specialists to design innovative approaches, while Mongol mobility prevented Jin relief forces from breaking the blockade. And so we come to the end of perhaps the most extraordinary transformation in human history. From that starving 9-year-old boy abandoned on the steppes to the master of an empire spanning continents, Genghis Khan proved that circumstances don't determine destiny, choices do. His legacy lives on in the DNA of 16 million descendants, in trade routes that still connect east and west, and in a tomb that remains hidden somewhere in the Mongolian wilderness, guarding its secrets for 8 centuries. The nomad who ruled the world reminds us that true power isn't inherited, it's earned through vision, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of something greater than survival.